Welcome to the Mad in America podcast, your source for science, psychiatry, and social justice.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Mad in America. Our guest today is Talia Weiner. Talia is a critical psychologist, a psychological and medical anthropologist, and a licensed professional counselor. She currently works as a professor in psychology at my alma mater, the University of West Georgia. In addition to teaching classes at West Georgia and running the Clinical Ethnography Lab, Talia is engaged in ongoing research into both the structural and sociopolitical, as well as the lived experience dimensions of mental health. Talia has an upcoming book to be published through NYU Press's Anthropologies of American Medicine, Culture, Power, and Practice series. The title of that book is Therapeutic Inequalities, Mood Disorder Self-Management in Chicago. I asked Talia if she would speak with me today about this book and her work in general. So thank you for speaking with me today, Talia.
Thank you.
To start off, tell us a little bit about your trajectory in psychology. The psychology / anthropology / human development program at the University of Chicago looks really unique. So what is your sort of journey been like? And then what are your kind of central concerns in your work?
Thank you so much, Micah. I really admire Mad in America, and it's great to get to have this conversation with you as alumnus of West Georgia psychology. Okay, so the journey before, during, and after my PhD, I'm going to start by going back a couple of decades here to my undergraduate. I went to Swarthmore College, which is a small liberal arts college. I double majored in psychology and English. I knew that I felt like these two disciplines were somehow connected, but I didn't really have a language for talking about how. And I actually didn't know anything about anthropology at the time. And for some reason, it never occurred to me during college to take an anthropology class. But I was really lucky because within Swarthmore's otherwise pretty traditional psych department were these two professors who were completely, as you probably know, outside of the mainstream. And they were hugely influential on me. So Jean Marichek and Ken Gergen trained me to think about things like the role of language and narrative in our psychological experiences, and to interrogate the cultural, sociological, historical, and political bases of our given psychological categories. I didn't realize it at the time, but I was getting an education in critical psychology and psychological anthropology. It took a long time before I think I came to fully appreciate how very much outside of and really almost antithetical to the project of mainstream Western psychology my undergraduate training had been under Gergen and Marichek. And a few years after I graduated from college, I started thinking about applying to PhD programs. And I remember talking to Jean on the phone and her advice being pretty much, don't get a doctorate in a psychology department. Just don't do it. You're going to face constant invalidation about your methods, your approaches, your sort of foundational beliefs. And so she suggested, among a few other ideas, that I look into this interdisciplinary Department of Comparative Human Development at the University of Chicago, which is where I ended up. So the faculty members are a mix of psychologists, anthropologists, some sociologists, some biologists, a few education folks. And they train you to be interdisciplinary, but also to try to be intelligible to some discipline. So they said, find one primary disciplinary hat to wear based on the topics that you work on and the methods you use and how you read and what you write and what conferences you attend, and try to fit in somewhere. So for me, that disciplinary hat, that intellectual home ended up being psychological anthropology. And then one of the things that drew me to human development, to the department, was that for a while, it was actually accredited, not by the APA, but by this other organization, so that you could simultaneously train in anthropology and clinical psychology. And then when you graduated, you were qualified to sit for licensure as a clinical psychologist. And they called this the clinical track. And through it, we had these several cohorts before me of these really cool kind of hybrid therapist anthropologists who emerged and went out into the world. And that just seemed to me like such a great, valuable combination. Who wouldn't want a therapist who's also an anthropologist? So I was planning to do this program, the clinical track, but unfortunately it ended up getting discontinued early in my time in the PhD, which was sort of a blow because I, by then, had decided that that was what I wanted, to have one foot in anthropology and the other foot in clinical practice, and to be able to speak across those fields. So I decided to pursue 2 degrees at once, the PhD in comparative human development, and then at U Chicago, specializing in psychological anthropology, and then a separate master's degree in relational psychoanalytic psychotherapy elsewhere in Chicago. And it was that decision, sort of in the context of what was going on in Chicago at the time with public mental health care, which I'll talk about in a bit, that set the stage for the research that became the basis of my dissertation and later my book.
So your upcoming book, which is called Therapeutic Inequalities, Mood Disorder Self-Management in Chicago, is a deep dive into how conservative political structures end up influencing mental health practice, and about service users and therapists' lived experience at different clinical sites in Chicago. What inspired you to tackle this topic? I know you did a lot of anthropological ethnographic field work around mental health practice and activism in Chicago, and I'm imagining that this project has both kind of scholarly and personal dimensions.
It definitely has both of those dimensions. In the first and second years of my PhD program, we were required to do something that the department called trial research, basically like a small pilot study that might eventually become a piece of your larger dissertation project. And I didn't really know much about Chicago yet at that time. So mostly it was for more personal reasons that I decided for my trial research, I would do participant observation in a mood disorders support group that met once a week in a basement of some building. And I started to notice that every week the support group members would talk about and try to enact this thing that they called self-management, which I came to understand meant to them this notion that if they were really diligent, they could somehow learn to observe and anticipate and ultimately exercise control over their own mood disorders, which they tried to conceptualize as diseases that were separable from, quote unquote, who they really were. So fast forward a couple of years to late 2011, and Chicago elects neoliberal Mayor Rahm Emanuel, whose first order of business is to introduce a budget that proposes to shut down 6 of Chicago's 12 public mental health clinics. Chicago used to have this very renowned system. It's kind of unusual of mental health centers that were actually run by the city's Department of Public Health, and they were designed to meet the needs of poor and uninsured clients. And some of them had already been cut in the past, but there were 6, mostly in these working class, predominantly non-white neighborhoods. They were really important to the people who used them. And so Emmanuel says, okay, we're going to slash it from 12 down to 6. And we're going to, for the remaining 6, we're going to like pare down their services to like the bare bones. And right at the same moment that the City Council of Chicago unanimously approves this budget, all 50 aldermen gave it the green light. And the Chicago Department of Public Health starts dismantling the clinics. The Occupy Wall Street movement is starting and gaining momentum throughout the US. And so a grassroots activist coalition made up of consumers of a public mental health clinic in a working class African-American neighborhood right near the University of Chicago that was slated for closure got formed. And this coalition decides that it's going to occupy its clinic in protest of the upcoming closure. So they bring in enough materials to sort of barricade themselves inside the clinic for, I think, weeks or maybe a couple of months even. But they end up getting arrested within a few hours, spending the night in jail. However, this mental health coalition endured, and to this day, they're still working really hard to fight the city to reopen and expand the public mental health centers. So I was definitely getting a bigger sense of sort of Chicago and the activism scene and the politics and the inequalities a lot more than I knew when I was just getting started. And so in 2012, as I mentioned, I ended up, I joined the Mental Health Coalition because I was always walking by this encampment that they had next to the building that used to be the clinic. And the coalition is, consumers of the clinic or former consumers, but also allies of various kinds. And so I joined the Mental Health Coalition, and I also start my clinical training program at this school in downtown Chicago. And so I was constantly moving between these very disparate class settings. So a psychoanalytic school where my instructors adjunct at the school, but mainly treated middle-class patients in private practice. And then my clinical internship site, which was at an outpatient community mental health agency with working class clients, and then doing these political actions with the Mental Health Coalition. And it started to occur to me that you really can't begin to understand the meanings and outcomes of managing or self-managing a mental illness without considering the sociological context of that management. So at the Psychoanalytic Institute, it was a given that patients needed ongoing relational support in order to successfully manage their mental health issues, whereas in agency settings, the focus and goal of treatment was always oriented towards increasing the client's independence so that ideally they would eventually not require the support of a therapist. And then among members of the Mental Health Coalition, of course, self-management took on this really dire literal meaning because their struggle was one for basic inclusion in the face of total public abandonment. So I guess I would say that the project kind of evolved alongside my increasing familiarity with the political economic landscape of Chicago, the professional trajectory of therapists as these actors who moved between these different class modes from agency work with the poor early in their careers to private practice with the middle class later on. And with me kind of embodying this, through my own training, I got to move through the race and class stratified geography of the mental health care system. And that's how the project sort of developed.
So you've said about a bit about this already, but the central topic of your book does revolve around this notion of self-management. What is self-management?
Self-management does a lot of heavy lifting in the book, you could say. In the most narrow and sort of literal sense, it refers to a self-help treatment model, the one that the members of the mood disorder support group are constantly invoking. And it's a model that purportedly empowers patients to objectify and regulate their own conditions. Self-management, that clinical paradigm originally developed for the treatment of physiological chronic conditions, initially arthritis, and later it was applied to mental illnesses as psychiatry increasingly embraced a biomedical framing of its disorders as diseases of the brain that are, likened to physiological conditions and therefore should be manageable through the same technologies. But what I try to show in the book is that the clinical paradigm of self-management mirrors a much larger ideological project of self-management that works to both sustain and obscure many forms of structural inequality in U.S. mental health care. If there's time, I thought I'd just read a small excerpt from the book since there is a section called What is Self-Management? So self-management can take an economic, political, narrative, organizational, or clinical form. It is a mode that is at times actively claimed by, at times forced upon, and often subtly diffused into its subjects. Highly resonant with neoliberal ideals of individual sovereignty, self-management in each of its forms retains the quality of bestowing moral agency upon the individual by means of a kind of political economic mystification that eclipses the social networks and structural constraints in which the individual is embedded. Moreover, the duty to exercise sovereign self-management in the contemporary United States to triumph over various forms of structural vulnerability through autonomous acts of agency, entrepreneurship, and rational choice is disproportionately placed on the shoulders of individuals or communities who, by virtue of their socio-political positioning, are far from truly sovereign.
Thank you. And I think you've kind of touched on this a little bit as well, but you described this self-management project as self-defeating. Can you explain why that is?
So I talk about self-management in the book at certain points as being something that patients or clients do, and also as something that other kinds of actors, specifically therapists, are compelled to do. So in the case of clients, I talk about self-management as being self-defeating in the sense that if it's practiced strictly as described and as intended in, say, the bipolar self-management workbook, then the better you are at doing it, the more that you end up demonstrating how impossible it is. So, for example, in the mood disorder support group, clients would perform their expertise as self-managers. In a way, I felt like that was one of the reasons to go to the support group meeting, to sort of do self-management. And that was a way of, kind of keep staying on top of things. So they would perform their expertise as self-managers by expressing constant suspicion and doubt over the validity of their own moods, their plans, their ideas. Like someone would say in a meeting, I'm feeling really angry about this parking ticket that I got that I shouldn't have gotten, but I don't know if it's an actual legitimate anger or if I'm becoming hypomanic and I need to adjust my medications. Or one time, this really intelligent guy who had dropped out of graduate school because of his mental health issues said to me, he said, a few weeks ago, it occurred to me that I could do a project. I could write a paper on my own, I had an idea and it seemed interesting and it would give me something to do. And as I've gotten more medicated, that idea has kind of slipped away from me. So is that me losing a thread of mania, or is that the drugs completely, just sort of squashing me flat? And then he says, I don't know. Would another person in my situation, I'm on disability, would another person want to do some work? Or would they be okay with basically doing nothing, which is mostly what I do with my day, is nothing, and I don't know. So what I meant by self-defeating here is that we see that these practices of hyper-rational self-interrogation don't instantiate the sort of isolable real self or agentive sovereign self for support group members that the self-management paradigm promises. Instead, it blurs self and disease. It divides the managing subject into fragmented selves and creates uncertainty and ultimately distress. Later in the book, I start looking up the structurally impossible situations that therapists find themselves in. And I argue that they turn to a kind of professional narrative self-management in an attempt to recover a sense of themselves as moral agents. So specifically, I look at the different forms of discursive labor that therapists undertake to alleviate the guilt that they experience when they follow the normative professional trajectory of putting in time working at an agency with poor clients at the beginning of their careers and then transitioning into better compensated private practice with middle-class patients once they're qualified to sit for licensure. There's a chapter in the book where I do a close reading of the narratives that 3 different therapists shared with me about their transition from agency work to private practice. And I look at the strategies that each of the therapists use to organize their narrative in a way that allows them to feel that they acted ethically and agentively. I argue that the narrative self-management strategies that they use, which I describe respectively as sublimation, class disidentification, and bargaining, are successful to that end, but the success comes at a cost. They produce a kind of structural alienation that prevents the therapist from recognizing and naming the actual structural causes of their, quote unquote decision, which isn't really a decision to leave agency work for private practice.
So throughout your book, you're talking about these self-management demands, demands for autonomy. I think you said individual sovereignty or something like that. And you pose this against what you call a cybernetic model of agency. What is the cybernetic model?
So when I talk about cybernetics, I always like to go back to anthropologist Gregory Bateson's fantastic 1972 essay about Alcoholics Anonymous, which is called The Cybernetics of Self. So in the essay, Bateson writes that the first two steps of Alcoholics Anonymous's 12-step approach do something really profound. He says that when alcoholics take the first two steps, which are we admitted we were powerless over alcohol and we came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity, they're accomplishing a major epistemological correction. They're moving from what Bateson calls the myth of self-power to a view of the self and its actions as embedded within broader systems or relationships. So it's a shift away from our deeply held ideologies of Western individualism that say that we can and should be able to autonomously control ourselves through sheer willpower, the pull yourself up by the bootstraps, mind over matter mentality that undergirds self-management and a lot of neoliberal policies, to an understanding of self as total system, which Bateson reminds us doesn't coincide usually with the boundaries of the individual body. There's a passage I really like where Bateson says, consider a blind man with a stick. Where does the blind man's self begin? At the tip of the stick, at the handle of the stick, or at some point halfway up the stick? And then he says these questions are nonsense because the total self-corrective unit of blind man with stick, which thinks and acts and decides, is a system whose boundaries do not at all coincide with the boundaries of either the body or what is popularly called the self or consciousness. In my book, I argue that the move from an autonomous to a cybernetic model of self and agency is not only a matter of epistemological correctness, although it is that, but also of epistemic justice. A model that says that we are all interconnected, that we all need ongoing social support, and that our agency is always partial and distributed, turns out to be a lot more humane and livable than one that says that you should figure it all out on your own. And yet what I found in my research is that psychiatry and psychotherapy, and really our contemporary society in general, tends to systematically offer that cybernetic model only to the middle class and to demand impossible, complete autonomous self-management from those who have the least. Moreover, when we, meaning experts and clinicians, et cetera, justify these epistemic injustices through self-managerial discourses that obscure the structural inequalities, we end up imputing to different classes of patients disparate subjectivity so that it begins to seem right and therapeutically appropriate to say that middle-class patients are in need of long-term relationally supportive therapeutic interventions, while working-class clients benefit most from self-sufficiency and independence.
So a big focus in your book is specifically on mood disorders like bipolar disorder. What insights did you come to when looking at the relationship between bipolar and this self-management?
Bipolar disorder kind of occupies a funny position in psychiatric ontology. It's classified as you know, as a mood disorder, not a thought disorder. So it often is regarded as more manageable than, say, schizophrenia. But at the extreme, mania can look just like psychosis. Fundamentally, as anthropologist Emily Martin has written, being known as a bipolar person throws one's rationality into question. And yet the self-management paradigm, which is considered to be very well suited to individuals with bipolar disorder, demands a kind of hyper-rational self-surveillance and self-control that would arguably be impossible for anyone to perform, let alone a person living with that diagnosis. I think the biggest insight that I gained from looking at the relationship between bipolar and self-management was that in doing self-management with dedication and a sort of expertise, bipolar self-managers show us the limits of the paradigm. And sometimes they end up inadvertently creating alternative cybernetic models of personhood and agency. So it's kind of a story about the conditions of possibility for unmaking our own unlivable ideologies and embodying an outside to them or creating an otherwise.
You make some really nuanced arguments in your book around community mental health and agency work, in contrast to private practice therapy, in particular psychoanalysis. I'm curious if there's any takeaways from comparing and contrasting these different fields of clinical practice.
At one level, the big takeaway seems to be that private practice psychoanalysis, psychotherapeutic work with the middle class, really offers a lot more of these models of personhood and agency and social and relational support that are ultimately going to lead to flourishing and success. Whereas agency models tend toward, and I'm not saying that every therapist that I knew in agencies did this only, but tend toward interventions that were short term, that were independence oriented, and that this and the way it got sort of rationalized ended up naturalizing disparities. But so there's a place in the book where I write about a training that I attended where I learned how to write service notes for these 15-minute increments of work that we did with clients at agencies for Medicaid reimbursement. And in the training, we learned that there were two types of billing codes that we could use. One was community support individual, and the other was therapy/counseling. But that most of the time, given our clients' needs and the sort of work that we would be doing with them, the community support individual would be the appropriate choice. And now, undeniably, there were real differences between what a lot of agency clients needed from a therapist and what, say, a patient in private psychoanalysis was looking for. And a lot of the times, agency clients did need community support in the sense that they needed help finding stable housing or, looking for a job. But the thing was that sometimes there would be an agency client who wanted more of a relational, introspective type of therapeutic process. And they were allowed to, there was nothing stopping you from giving it, but the norms and procedures at the agency would almost work against that, making it seem as though the agency client was dispositionally better suited to the short-term community support stuff. And sometimes there were reasons having to do with billing protocols that undergirded the notion that an agency client was better served by one type of intervention than another. But the problem was that those reasons were often forgotten, and the treatment differences got naturalized as just more therapeutically appropriate. So it's not that treatment differences exist in and of themselves that was the problem. As I wrote in the book at one point, when the continuity of market relations and care is presumed and institutionally demanded rather than interrogated, we run the risk of naturalizing structural inequalities that could instead be named and problematized. So all of that said, toward the end of the book, I also do kind of complicate the argument a bit by pointing out that there may be some things about cybernetic selfhood that agency work can actually teach us if we were to expand our notions in a way that allowed what we do at agencies to be part of that. So I argue that what we usually describe in agencies as case management, which is a really large component of the work that we do with agency clients, acknowledges and allows a kind of material entanglement of client, therapist, and material world that psychoanalytic practice assiduously avoids. Meaning that a lot of what we do with clients at agencies would be considered inappropriate enactments in psychoanalytic therapy. And while there are good reasons to uphold those boundaries, much of the time, maybe it would be okay for private practice therapists to model sometimes a type of work that does recognize and intervene in the patient's structural, material world conditions. There's actually a lot of talk within psychoanalytic communities about social consciousness and what its place is in kind of social justice. And so, maybe if those sort of norms were shifted a bit, we could find new ways for psychoanalysis to kind of handle the social and the structural differently.
Speaking of social justice, and also a term that you mentioned earlier, epistemic justice, can you speak to what you envision might help the field in terms of the self-management problems that you're kind of noticing in Chicago, but also more generally, how do we move in the right direction away from these structural inequalities and contradictions? You do mention in your book something called structural competency training. I think for clinicians, right?
Yeah, and I think that this is something that I'm still really thinking about and want to leave the book as sort of an opening to that conversation. I'm compelled to think about structural competency, which is sort of this newer notion that maybe clinicians shouldn't be treating an individual for a problem that is in the, in the social, in the structural. But I know that there are also important critiques to structural competency that I don't want to, minimize. What I was thinking when I kind of said that in the book was that a lot of times when clinicians are writing about and talking about structural competency, it thinks quite a bit about the structural barriers and issues in the lives of the patient, which is, of course, important and good. But I sort of thought that maybe what we need is more of a form of structural competency in clinical training that turns its gaze more reflexively toward the problematic social structures, institutions, and policies impeding clinicians' practice, in addition to those that more directly impact patients. So such an approach might equip therapists who are caught in the sorts of binds that I describe in the book with some critical tools to identify moments of structural impasse within their own professional activities and to articulate, if not necessarily resolve, the ways in which their local institutional practices might be undermining the provision of structurally competent care. This, in turn, could provide therapists with options other than the individual self-management of structural constraints and the disavowal of market logics. So I don't think that the burden of structural recognition and change should fall only or mostly on therapists. They're pretty constrained actors. And I think that training therapists to collectively see and acknowledge social structures in their own workplaces and to really sit with their own inadequate set of options rather than moving automatically to overcome or erase them could maybe paradoxically point the way to the beginning of an alleviation of these deeply entrenched social inequalities.
Your book was really eye-opening to me. As someone who has been kind of immersed in a lot of the theory that you talk about, but I hadn't really seen it fleshed out so intimately in relation to people's lived experience. So I just wanted to say thank you. I think it's a really interesting book that people should read. Your book isn't even out yet, but I still want to ask, what's next for you? Are you planning on continuing some of the themes of the book, or moving in another direction?
So yeah, I first started attending those mood disorder support group meetings in Chicago in 2009. Rahm Emanuel won the election in 2011. The clinics shut down in 2012. I did the bulk of my ethnographic research from 2013 to 2015, graduated with my PhD in 2017, and now it's 2025, and the book is finally coming out at the end of this year. So I did do some other small projects along the way in my postdoc in Cleveland and with a research collective at the start of the pandemic. But really, it's mainly been the Therapeutic Inequalities project for over a decade. And so I am really excited to start something new. At this point, have two barely, sketched out kind of directions that I'm thinking about. One of them I have been calling still COVIDing in a post-pandemic world. And I guess I would say that while the majority of institutions and individuals in the US regularly talk about the COVID-19 pandemic as an event firmly situated in the past, various counter-publics have emerged and mobilized around the identity category of still COVIDing. And this is something that I've, personally been involved with. So I have talked to people in these still COVIDing communities who really like the idea of maybe an ethnographer who has been there, as part of the community all along, giving a better representation of the experiences. And so I was thinking that I could do research examining the contours of still COVIDing as a form of subjectivity and community, looking among other questions at how notions of mental health and illness science, politics, and society are shaped by an existential and epistemological positioning that is out of sync with mainstream consensus reality. So that's kind of one idea. And then I will also confess that there's a little part of me that has thought about jumping into the conversations happening right now around AI and mental health care. A couple of months ago, actually, Mad in America covered a study from Dartmouth that tested whether AI could replicate the tone and empathy of peer support, which it describes as a model of care built on shared lived experience. And, disturbingly, but probably not all that surprisingly, it turned out that a lot of the time people couldn't tell the difference between a supportive message written by a human and one written by generative AI, which raised some questions around notions of empathy and what it might mean if empathy is completely decoupled from things like presence, mutuality, and shared vulnerability. I'm in an institutional context right now where there's a lot of pressure to feel optimism around AI and embrace a spirit of collaboration, or at least to accept that this is the future, like it or not. And I even have a few colleagues who are therapists who see innovations with artificial intelligence and mental health care as something to celebrate. And so part of me would maybe like to challenge myself to get inside some space where these ideas and technologies are coming into being and be the ethnographer in the room. And maybe even thinking of the model of peer support in particular, of which, as you know, that's already a pretty fraught topic with plenty of interesting questions surrounding its ethics. I think it could be at least, an interesting thought experiment to think about what other forms of relationship might be modeled by an experience of empathy from a chatbot. Like maybe, as one of my kind of AI positive colleagues suggested to me, maybe we need to look more to theorizations of interspecies connection, like Donna Haraway's notion of companion species. Maybe the metaphor of peer support is not exactly right, but there's some other kind of relationship where we can envision empathy meaning something different. And so, yeah, I'm definitely looking forward to kind of as soon as the book is completely out, to trying to jump into another project. And that's really everything I know for now. And thank you so much for taking the time today.
Thank you, Talia. Thank you for speaking with me today.
Thank you for listening to the Mad in America podcast. For more news, views, and updates, visit madinamerica.com.